people to go down that road. He's a geographer.
All right. Woo-hoo! Go geography.
I'm Chris. I'm a postdoc here. I study ecology,
Racialized, geographer, aspects of urban greening, treating people.
Hi, Nick. Welcome. I'm Margaret Palmer.
Thanks so much. Nice to meet you.
Hey, and Nick and I know each other well. Nick is my mentor. So I invited Nick because he's my mentor and because I think what he does is valuable. He earned his PhD from Indiana University in 2002. I'm just going to briefly introduce him. Currently, he's a full professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Georgia. He's the deputy lead PI on the Coweta LTER, which is based in North Carolina. He's also affiliated as a faculty member with the Georgia Coastal Ecosystems LTER. So he's involved in the LTER network, as a lot of the postdocs here are as well. He's served in various capacities on many, many different journals.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you all so much. I was talking to Ginger earlier today, and what did I say? This is like an intellectual playground. It feels like it's just like such a warm space that it's really nice to be here. Thanks to y'all for coming. I've been given various versions of the talk that I'm going to launch into today. And this will be the last time that I give this talk, and then I'm going to sit down to actually write it up and do something else with it. had a series of conversations with Dean last night over dinner, thinking about the work that gets done here, which were really important and useful for me to think about exactly kind of some of the directions. You know, when you try and give like a 45-minute talk, it doesn't translate so well into an 8,000-word paper. So there's all the holes and gaps. I'm also hoping that some of the conversation we can have will help me think through those gaps and holes. A lot of the thinking that I've been engaged in recently is new as let's say about a decade or so, in terms of thinking about the U.S. South in particular ways. I'm not from the South. I didn't identify with the South in any particular way, but through doing kind of ethnographic work, especially increasingly on Sapelo Island with Dean. There's one particular kitchen table that Dean and I have spent a fair bit of time on at someone's home, Miss Cornelia Walker Bailey, who just passed away in October 15, who really started to transform how I thought about questions of property, thought about questions of race, thought about questions of ecology, thought about these things that we talk about as socio-ecological relations. And so I just wanted to give her a shout out as having quite profound impacts on how I think about things. When I moved to Georgia, I did not imagine, in fact I was quite vehement, that I was not going to embrace or kind of get sucked into the history of the Civil War. But as you start to think about race relations and property relations and socio-ecological systems in the U.S. South, you have to. It's just too important when we talk about abolitionist politics and the way in which so many of the institutions of slavery are still with us today in terms of societal structure. So with all that, there are two quite important moments that I set off from. The first one here we see in 1864, when General Sherman lights Atlanta ablaze, and we see the battle for Atlanta occur, leaving only 400 buildings standing. It's the only time we've seen a U.S. city kind of fall to warfare in this particular kind of way. So there's all kinds of infrastructural and social questions that come out of this moment of the Civil War, and start to open up a series of quite profound territorial logics that I think are still haunting and engaging with the South. Another quite important moment is Sherman's march to the sea. And you can see on this map, moving from Atlanta to the Georgia coast, the way in which processes, explicitly racialized processes of land enclosure start to unfold, reconfiguring the way in which folks are thinking about place, space, all these communities. And again, as a moment in the Southeast, this becomes, I think, a really overlooked particular kind of politics that has profound ramifications for thinking about property and ecology to that degree. And I want to kind of say, put in motion a sort of a path-dependent logic, which much of this project is about trying to unpack. If we go back and think about Atlanta, the coast, the march to the sea, there are two main dynamics that I try and take out of this to kind of situate and to think about this question of enclosure, this question of the commons that ultimately I'm going to try and get to, and which is a way of thinking about property relations and ecosystems in a more open, less private way. The two things that come out of this and that give rise to the importance of the Southeast and allow for it to unfold as it does is the way in which transportation infrastructure penetrates down from the northern economy, and the way in which kind of the emergence of capitalism leads to the rail line that ends in Atlanta. Atlanta was initially called Terminus as the end of the rail line. So you can see the way in which capitalist infrastructure, capitalist economic development, uneven development is embedded within this region as it's starting to evolve. And the other really key, quite important moment here, we go back to the 1830s, we see the U.S. forcibly remove the indigenous folks who had been living here for so long. So we're talking especially here about the Cherokee and the Cree. So we have the Trail of Tears, which many of us think about or know about, learned about in 5th grade, but don't think about perhaps as fundamentally as when we're thinking about the kind of ecological stability or the property regimes and forms of environmental governance that still exist, right? So part of the argument that I want to make is that we have to take these things very seriously, right? That decolonizing space necessitates that we think about the violence that's been done to that space and haunts that space in particular ways. And I'll extend that a little bit to say that trying to think through the translation for folks that don't like or don't maybe think about racial histories in particular ways. I mean, the way in which agriculture unfolded within this region, the way now that forestry is a dominant kind of land use, especially if we think about Sherman's March to the Sea, right? We think about the way in which watersheds have been impacted through these processes. There are all those sorts of things that we can go more specifically in, and I would argue connect back to the fundamental transformation of this space through these political moments. Especially if we think about ecological governance. And I think that ecological governance becomes a quite important way for me to think through some of the translation of the project here. If we get out the textbook and we start to think about ecological governance and we start to think about property relations, we're likely to find a bunch of white men named Karl Marx, Karl Polanyi, and Edward Thompson. Right? These three folks are quite fundamental in how we think about the commons, common use resources, common property regimes, through a whole host of ways that penetrate and think through questions of political economy. Right? And that in itself offers up, I think, a quite important contradiction if we go back to the history that I was just talking about. Right? Because all three of these men draw upon a very particular and unique European history to think through the way in which property relations play out. Which is not to say that they're wrong or bad or whatever, it's just to say that it's very different. It's a very different kind of European, Eurocentric history that we still, many of us still start with when we think about the kinds of questions that I'm interested in right now. And that offers, I think, a set of limitations. So we were talking earlier today about how do we decolonize the logics with which we kind of proceed to ask particular kinds of questions. And I think that this is an important moment that goes back to a conversation I was having this morning, which is to say, like, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, is at least not where I stand on this. There's still a lot of value in all kinds of thinking around how common land has developed and been enclosed in particular ways. But how do we add to that? How do we move on? How do we get beyond it in particular ways? Another, I'd say perhaps the most important and arguably profound thinker in terms of the ideas of how common land resources are governed and thought about and utilized is Lynn Ostrom, who many of us might be familiar with. First woman to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, quite profound. I had the privilege of knowing her a bit when she was at Indiana, when I was at Indiana. And she was always a very kind of warm soul as far as graduate students looking for meals and places to hang out and drinks to be had. At the same time, if we think through in the same manner in which I've just kind of put up the Karls and Edward, there are a host of quite profound problems here to think about racialized processes whereby land gets enclosed, and how can we think about the commons, and how can we set an agenda of thinking through some of these more emancipatory socio-ecological processes. So there are 8 key takeaways from her book, and instead of just listing them out, I'll just kind of mention them very quickly to set up in a more concrete way some of the problems that I think exist when we think about the commons. And the Eurocentricity still kind of inherent to that project. So the first principle that she talked about, and again, it's also important to say that she's coming out of this from a game theoretic perspective, which is quite prominent within political science. Just as a kind of a disciplinary context. So the first is that in thinking about how to manage the commons, first we have to define clear group boundaries. Okay? Sounds straightforward enough. Second, match rules governing use of common goods to local needs and conditions. Third, ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. So that's agency. Right? 4, make sure the rule-making rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. 5, develop a system carried out by community members for monitoring members' behavior. 6, use graduated sanctions for rule violators. 7, provide accessible low-cost means for dispute resolution. And 8, build responsibility for governing the common resource in nested tiers from the lowest level up to the entire interconnected system. You don't need to memorize those, and there won't be a test on this. The point that I'm trying to make is there are a whole host of assumptions in the way in which we think about managing the commons that arguably are as important as any other set of ideas. If we overlay that when we think about the racialized history of the U.S. South, and we think about the way in which folks who came out of slavery thinking about property relations, there's a major disconnect there, right? Try to imagine the second main goal there. Match rules governing use of common goods to local needs and conditions. Or the third one, ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. That third one especially, I'll say it one more time. Ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. We think about the way in which democratic systems operate today and the racialized dynamics therein. We can see the uneven power, the lack of access, the inability of many folks within society to have any say in how rules are managed around property. You know, we can punctuate that point by saying that 98% of property in the United States is owned by white folks. Right? I mean, that's a quite profound statistic that one of a brilliant undergraduate student, Elizabeth Wilkes, who I work with, has been doing some work on trying to show like that there's a lot of embedded unevenness within these property regimes. So what do geographers say about some of this? Like some geographers in the house, and I didn't mean to be all boostery about the geographers. I like all disciplines. But if we think about what geographers are saying, there's a lot. There's a lot of being said. So this is the most recent. You don't have to. This is a prop. You don't have to. You're not supposed to read that. The most recent thing that I've found within kind of geography specific is this essay by Matthew Turner, who's a political ecologist at the University of Wisconsin. And I know Matt to be a very thorough and thoughtful and deliberate thinker. And so I take his review of the state of the art literature to be very important and solid. Okay? I say all that to say that of the 53 sites, 52 references in this review paper, not a single one of them deals with race or racial dynamics or uneven racial development in the context of the commons. Right? That's not, I don't think, because Matt has missed anything. Right? The point that I'm trying to punctuate here is that in 2017, we're not talking about this. We're not thinking about property relations beyond very narrowly defined private property relations in terms of how folks can get greater access. Right? And again, you can perhaps hear me say property relations, and maybe what I would encourage us all to do is then to think about various kinds of ecological or socio-ecological problems that we might be more interested in and see them as contained within particular property regimes. Okay? That way I don't have to keep saying stream ecology, which I don't know anything about. But I recognize it's super important. Okay. So then the book that I have carried around the most with me over the last 7 years and tried to think about the most and have just recently taught for the first time in a graduate seminar to start to imagine how to address this glaring hole is this one. The 738-page mammoth, published in 1935, written by a sociologist, although geographers are starting to claim him, W.E.B. Du Bois.
Geographers are possessive.
Yes, we are. Very territorial. W.E.B. Du Bois' brilliant book, Black Reconstruction in America, thinking about the aftermath of the Civil War, much in the way that, where I'm at now, thinking about property relations. And he sets out a whole very sophisticated history and theoretical framing of kind of what needs to be done, what can be done, what has been done, right? And it's a brilliant, brilliant piece of work that I highly recommend. And the kernel that I've taken from this book and have now working on in lots of different ways is his idea of abolition democracy. Abolition democracy. And what he says in great detail about abolition democracy is that how African American slaves during slavery, fighting against the Confederacy, which was really about fighting for their freedom, increasingly recognized that the freedom that they had imagined might very well be impossible. Right? So he kind of walks us through like how this goal, all this effort, might result in nothing. Right? And the reason he says this is because that so many of the political, economic, and cultural institutions within the South were based fundamentally in the ideology of African American inferiority. Right? So the idea of being free within a society that thinks that you're inferior anyway is not freedom. Right? This is the argument that he makes. And so what he kind of does is he starts to think through at the institution level, what does a complete reconfiguration of society look like that might actually yield emancipation or freedom. Okay? And so this is his idea of abolition democracy. And it's where my idea that I've been building from of abolition ecology is just trying to think through in more specific ways, how does this play out around property dynamics and socio-ecological kinds of relations of a more concrete type. Du Bois does talk about property in a very particular way, and there's a whole chapter about it. And so there's lots of insights to take away from him. And furthermore, which I think is really important, if I walk back through the other thinkers that right now are the go-tos on some of these questions, right? His experience, not just as an African-American man, but as someone who was struggling and was the one to call out the problem of the 20th century was going to be the problem of race. I mean, the logic there forces us to think through and take much more seriously what abolitionist politics might require. As much as I love this book and have been inspired by it, there's actually another book that I found that has opened up for me what has been one of the most kind of rewarding and creative mysteries of intellectual history. It was a report that he published in 1907 called Economic Cooperation Among Negro Americans. So Black Reconstruction is published in 1935. This is published in 1907. Okay, do the math. Not so good with numbers. Before a couple decades. Okay. In it, what he is doing is thinking already about how institutions can come together and necessarily had to come together within slavery to start to generate the ideas of what he ultimately called abolition democracy, but to generate freedom, to generate the ability to exist within society. So there are two excerpts that I just want to point out because they become very important. The first, on page 24 of this report, he says, "It was the church too, or rather the organization that went by the name church, that many of the insurrections among the slaves from the 16th century down had their origin. We must find in these insurrections a beginning of cooperation, which eventually ended in the peaceful economic cooperation." So just in that passage, he sets up insurrections, much bloody, violent slave revolt, right? Getting to a process whereby there can be peaceful economic cooperation, right? And that was the path that many folks had to be on, given the reign of white supremacy that existed. Okay? He goes on a couple pages later to say, "We find that the spirit of the revolt, which tried to cooperate by means of insurrection, led to widespread organization for the rescue of fugitive slaves among Negroes themselves, and developed before the war in the North and during and after the war in the South into various cooperative efforts toward economic emancipation and land buying." Right? So in 1907, he's thinking through how do folks come together and start to engage in private property relations, but with larger ends. Right? Now that might not seem all that important if you're, depending on where you're at on your readings around property relations, but I would argue that thread of discussion becomes very profound as we try to find earlier moments within some of these ideas where we can start to build broader anti-racist or decolonial thinking around property relations and socio-ecological systems. But the thing that it like literally wakes me up sometimes to try and figure out like how this puzzle comes together is that Du Bois takes as an inspiration on the very first page of this document and uses two ideas in quotes from Frederick Ratzel. Does anyone know who Ratzel is? So Ratzel is a very important geographer. In terms of German geographer, Ratzel is, many people would consider to be the grandfather of environmental determinism. Right? So if we start to think about environmental ethics and the way in which people and land are connected in the way in which we think about them, Ratzel's the one who essentially works to develop a series of ideas that Adolf Hitler takes on to think about the Holocaust and the eradication of a whole host of people that he doesn't think should be on the planet, right? So geography has some really scary ideas that developed out of how do we think about humans and land relations. But the thing is so interesting here, right, is that Du Bois takes from Ratzel two ideas to build his own work. And so there are two things I'll just mention. One of them, he says, a Ratzel quote that Du Bois uses, "Among the great groups of natural races, the Negroes are the best and keenest tillers of the ground." He also says, "The market is the center of all this more steering life in African Negro communities, and attempts to train him to culture have made the most effectual start from this tendency." So land and market, right? He mobilizes Ratzel in a very particular way. Now, it's only in the 21st century now where we look back on history that we can see how much damage Ratzel's ideas have done, right? So one way of thinking about this is like, at the time, the time of Du Bois's writing, Ratzel was one of the most prominent people talking about essentially ecology, right? It's also very important to say that he was greatly informed by Ernest Haeckel, right? Another German who maybe might be closer to home for some of us, who helps essentially coin the idea of ecology, right, prior to Tansley's discussion of ecosystems. So we can see this evolution and this kind of co-evolution of human-land interactions that today we kind of take for granted. And I think one of the points here, what I'm trying to make, is that the embeddedness of white supremacist logic within the way in which these things have been always framed is still kind of lurking, perhaps. Maybe not in stream ecology, but maybe. So digging deeper, this is the magic bullet that I find that furthers along kind of this logic that I have of the way in which white supremacist ideas are always ever present and the way they sneak in and we forget about them. And so this is a letter that I found in a Du Bois archive. All right. So the thing that I can figure out is that Du Bois wrote a letter to Clark Weisler asking him for information about essentially kind of anthropology and geography, land use dynamics as he's writing this 1907 report. Right? And so it's Weisler that turns Du Bois on to Ratzel, right? That introduces him to this idea. So as I dig deeper into Weisler's biography, again trying to figure out how do these ideas come to be embedded within this larger genealogy, Weisler, it turns out, is very much, so he was a curator at the American Museum of Natural History, right? Curator. Natural history, right? Worked there from 1902 to 1907. Had a PhD in anthropology, or some version of anthropology at the time. But what becomes clear is that he was central to the U.S. eugenics movement, right? Racial, like a scientific racism. So again, which is not that uncommon. It actually, so finding this out, then going back and thinking through the connections between ecology, ecosystem kind of analyses of all sorts, and the eugenics movement becomes, like there's a lot of folks in that tent. So again, Like it matters, and we haven't really done a lot of work to uncover it yet. Okay? So that all that is a little bit of like a distraction in lots of ways. If I try and go from Du Bois trying to think about like how do we actually think about actually existing commons? How do we think about property relations in a more egalitarian, anti-racist, abolitionist kind of way? But it's not, right? Because it also offers up the warning signs. It's then when I start to get to, again, more contemporary thinkers to continue to build ideas that I think get us through some of this muddiness and into places where I think there's a lot of room for thinking about abolitionist ecology and the notion of abolitionist commons or common ecological governance kind of regimes. So Clyde Wood unfortunately just passed away 2 years ago. I was fortunate enough to have organized a panel in 2009 in which he was talking about another book that's quite important in geography by someone else who just passed away, Neil Smith, a book called Uneven Development. This was the 25th anniversary of kind of the thinking about this book. And fortunately, I had a tape player going, right? Because some of the things that Clyde on this panel in Las Vegas said are some of, I would argue, some of the most important geographic thought right now kind of circulating around. And I have a long excerpt. I won't read all of it. I'll just read a tiny little bit to give you a sense of how Clyde, in thinking about the notion of the production of space and the way in which uneven development kind of unfolds, inserts into it a particular kind of racialized history and makes it not as neutral and kind of colorblind as it has historically been for many folks working in geography and other fields. So I was sitting right next to him. I'm watching him scratching his notes. He's jamming. And this is what he says. He says, part of the analysis, and I'm probably misreading it, is that capitalism extends outward. The plague of locusts destroys one commons after another. We can think about Marx. We can think about Thompson. We can think about Polanyi's kind of European thinking about the expansion of capitalism. That's largely what he's referring to there. But I also think that in that process, it is creating commons. The commons is not just a pre-capitalist formation. It's creating the idea by the people who are displaced by this process. It's creating the idea that there are new alliances to create new commons. But it's also creating new commons themselves, on the margins, in the swamps, as they say in New Orleans, but through a number of different ways by working class communities. New commons were created based on enclosures, but also on the understanding of the rationality of capitalist and chaotic nature of capitalism itself, particularly for racialized communities. There is this constant search for a new common because they are also enclosed, spatially enclosed. Even within these enclosures created by capital, they create commons within these enclosures. So it gets a little M.C. Escher-esque, right? But what we want to take away from this is that the take-it-for-grantedness of enclosure and the way in which property regimes get commodified and brought into private property relations offer up alternative ways and other kinds of creative ways for thinking about property. Right? And we go farther on that. I want to go back to the history, though, right? Because I realize I've just wandered way out into all kinds of intellectual history. And I want to bring this back to that moment in 1865, 1864, where we see the burning of Atlanta and Sherman's march to the sea. Because something quite tremendous occurs on January 16th of 1865. General Sherman issues Special Field Order 15. All right. Special Field Order 15, if you're not familiar, is the text that lays out the phrase 40 acres and a mule. Right. It is this where Sherman is saying, how do we think about reparations? Right, so the whole idea of reparations in any concrete way comes out of this text in a very historically and concrete way. And the argument is that essentially this space along the southeast coast will be set aside for freed African Americans so they can start a new society. Set aside and turned into essentially a commons, right, that will be then negotiated and sorted through. Right? So 1865 is not that long ago if we think about U.S. history, Although the idea that this region, would be set aside in this particular way is almost unimaginable now if you go down there and spend any time on along the southeastern coast. All right. And it's very important to say how and why this came about. Sherman wasn't necessarily a nice guy. I mean, it's not that it just came out of the goodwill of his heart. There were actually a couple key moments that occurred. The first one, very tragically, there was a mass drowning event where Union troops were crossing Ebenezer Creek outside of Savannah. The Union forces moved their pontoon bridge, and it's hard to get the number, but hundreds, if not more, recently freed folks drowned. Right? And it caused quite an emotional kind of response, as you might imagine. These folks had nowhere else to go. So this question of how do we situate folks who have become freed, the idea of how does emancipation actually work out, started to be grappled with in quite profound ways. So the second key moment here is that Secretary Stanton, who was Lincoln's Secretary of War, comes to Savannah with Sherman. They have a meeting in Savannah with 21 very prominent African-American clergy and other leaders. And they ask the question, okay, we've kind of figured out emancipation and freedom, but we don't know what to do now. What do we do now? How do we proceed? And one of the kind of profound moments that leads to Special Field Order 15 comes from Reverend Garrison Frazier, who to this question says and responds, the way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our labor. That is, by the labor of the women and the children and the old men, we can maintain ourselves and have something to spare. Right? So the centrality of land and having a place to rebuild a society in the wake of this tragedy leads to this. Now this only lasts for 11 months. President Johnson then comes into office and eliminates it and kind of go back to life as usual, where a lot of the property owners that had been driven out of there by the Civil War start to reclaim their property. Okay, but this moment offers up, I think, ways in which we can imagine in the not that distant past how the commons can operate. So I know what time it is, close with or bring two kind of empirical moments that I've been working on to contemporarily think through this. And the first, if anyone has spent any time with Dean, which hopefully y'all have because he's wonderful, is where Dean does a lot of work, and where I do a lot of work is here on Sapelo Island, which is included within that reserve map. Right, it's a barrier island off the coast of Georgia, and essentially we have a 434 acre portion of it that is right here, which is the largest remaining intact Gullah Geechee community in the United States. So these are direct descendants of slaves who were brought there in 1802 to operate this, what was in its entirety at various points, mostly a plantation. Okay, and there's all kinds of problematic issues going on right now for the saltwater Geechee community in terms of dispossession from their land, and these are some of the things that Dean is working on by himself and some stuff that he and I are working on. But out of this has come this very interesting opportunity whereby, because 97% of the island is now owned by the state of Georgia, through ongoing negotiations through the saltwater Geechee community, we have been able to set aside, or they have been able to set aside, increasing acres of land to be used for agricultural cultivation, right? That is essentially being held in common. It's kind of this negotiated land, and so what we've been trying to do is figure out how to establish what they call heritage crops. So a geneticist at Clemson has helped find particular strands of sugarcane that were grown on the island when it was a plantation that we're starting to reestablish. Now, I'll just say as a kind of a interesting and much more complicated side story here is that we had established the most successful patch of sugarcane last year, only to have hurricanes and sea level storm surge come in and kill it all and flood my tiller and destroy kind of essentially all the physical, I would say, physical progress we've made. I'd say that all the social progress that we've made, still exists. And so next Sunday I'm going to go back and pull out all the sugar cane and start to rebuild the beds, to replant another seed crop at the end of November, right? But the point here is if we can do the historical kind of work using our geographical imagination, I'll use that. Use our geographical imagination to think about 5 to 10 acres of land on Sapelo Island right now being held in common with the idea of economic revitalization of a community that had kind of gone through this very violent history and had been subjected to the horrors of slavery and the brutalization, even if a lot of the archives here say that Spalding, who was one of the first island owners, was really nice to his slaves. There's this really problematic narrative that comes out of some of the history of this island. We see these interesting opportunities, right? But we don't know how to situate them within this larger context. The other moment, but again, just to try to make the connection, Clyde Woods, W.E.B. Du Bois help us, as do other people. As do other people, help us think through the possibilities of this project, this process. The other kind of case study that I've been thinking through and working through is Shermantown. Shermantown was the spot in Atlanta that when Sherman's troops left the city, they had left this massive encampment. Think about how many Union troops there would have been there. They leave at a time when the city's population, the African American population, we see a jump in 1860 from 14,000 African Americans in the city to 1870, a jump to 33,000. Right, so there's this massive influx of freed folks that come from various kind of agricultural endeavor. And so this question of like, where do people live? How do we think through property relations? So when Sherman leaves Atlanta and sets aside this very large tract, we see the immediate kind of, out of necessity, but the development nonetheless of this new community, right, by freed people. And there's lots that we can say about it. There's an excerpt from, this is a picture from Harper's Weekly, 1879, kind of commenting on the development of this space. And the excerpt from the article says, "A feature of the city to which no well-ordered resident will be likely to direct a stranger's attention is Shermantown, a random collection of huts forming a dense Negro settlement in the heart of an otherwise attractive portion of the place." So you can still see the racialization of the space and the tensions that exist in 1879 when this space is being developed. But essentially, the space does become developed, and there's all kinds of institutional development, schools, churches that occur within here. What is so very interesting to me as a geographer is if we think about Shermantown flash forward, it is now what we call Sweet Auburn. So if you know Atlanta, Sweet Auburn is the place where Dr. King preached. It is oftentimes thought of as one of the cornerstone spots of the civil rights movement because of King's involvement. In 1956, there was an essay published in Fortune magazine that said Sweet Auburn was the richest Negro street in the world because there had been mass economic investment and development. Atlanta, of course, has a well-known history of kind of now being thought of as a black Mecca that comes out of the institutional building within the African-American community, kind of across the city in various ways. And some of that history is I think that there are some exaggerations at parts of it and some understatements at part of that history as I'm kind of getting deeper into it. But nonetheless, we think about the way in which Shermantown as a commons develops. And another very important moment in this history of the development of Sweet Auburn is the fact that in 1906 there's a very important race riot that occurs in Atlanta where a lot of African American folks feel unsafe because many of them had just been killed. And so they kind of retreat, and it becomes the place they retreat to. right? So the way in which the racial violence within the city, even as late as 1906, is still kind of driving particular kinds of property decisions and investment decisions becomes quite important. So then the last slide is just to kind of, for us to think through. I know this is kind of a sweeping, wild ride in many ways, but if we think about the relationship and the possibilities of space as set aside in commons, even recognizing the colonial logic to do so, right? The Sherman Reservation is what this was called, right? So we can think about the way in which the Cherokee, driven from here, driven to Oklahoma for the most part, and the reservation system and the way that colonial logic set people aside. I mean, in many ways, you know, you can very clearly imagine Sherman was thinking, no one wants that land anyway, so let's just put them over there, right? Which is, I think, again, in itself very interesting. But it opens up these kind of small experimental spaces and opportunities for thinking through land use and kind of egalitarian political projects, even if, you know, like there are all kinds of difficult questions that we can ask here. I mean, there's a lot been written about African-American kind of discussions around agriculture, right, and the violence that was done to them and like a rejection of doing that kind of work. I mean, the point is that this idea comes from the folks that live on the island. At the same time, we can think about this kind of evolution of a common space into Sweet Auburn, which is, again, this very important place. And I don't have time to go into it, but one of the very kind of interesting things about it is right there. There is one of the largest urban farms in the city of Atlanta being operated that, again, kind of opens up a whole host of different kinds of unique land uses that we think of as, you know, kind of having important socio-ecological ramifications in terms of food webs and eating local and, you know, food miles and all these sorts of things. So there's a lot more in the finite way of thinking about this. But then ultimately, just to say that it's you know, I go back to framing Du Bois's notion of abolition democracy as trying to think through these property relations and recognizing that to think about space in a way that is free of the kind of white supremacist logics that have driven so much spatial development, we kind of do got to start from the way back and rebuild a narrative that is more abolitionist oriented. So I'll stop there. Oh, yeah. Oh.
Well, it was just the last AAG in Boston, I was facilitating a panel that last minute.
Yeah.
And there were two non-academics on the panel that were talking about environment. There was human rights, human rights. And both of the non-academics, who were both people of color, identified property rights and property right regimes as like the major barrier to the provision of human rights for people of color. And sadly, because I was moderating, I didn't feel comfortable asking follow-ups on that because other people were asking other things, but I still regret that. I should have just screw like being nice or whatever or diplomatic, but I think that there's probably a lot in those, you know, discussions. Must resonate with what you're.
Oh, absolutely. Through. Oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that fundamental whatever proclamation, hypothesis, whatever you want to suggest. I mean, it gets at the root of all of this, right? I mean, the fact that post the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, there's this landlessness problem. That, you know, the wealth generation in this country is based in property, right? I mean, and
even looking into like the precarity and vulnerability of environmental migrants or environmental refugees, if you're willing to use that term. I mean, they're linking it back to property rights that are, you know, not just in the U.S. but also in Europe. So it seems very insidious to use a path dependent.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, I like. There's just so much that we could say here. I mean, I just think it's just like the fundamental. In many ways, I think it is the fundamental issue, and it's interesting that so few folks are kind of working through these historical logics to think through. I mean, I think that the question of reparations, for instance, become very important when we're thinking about the way in which political economy or political ecology of the United States property is working right now. We don't see African American communities gaining land. If anything, there's the continued dispossession and displacement. And we can think about a city like Atlanta, where we see this massive kind of suburbanization of poverty. It's now got the highest suburban poverty rate, where folks are being swept out of historic communities because gentrification and these other processes. But we can also see there's been long-standing, a mutual colleague of ours, Levi Van Zandt, has done work on kind of, and Brian Williams both have done work on black farmer and loss of land kind of historically, and the way in which the rise of agro-system economics is pushing black folks off of the land. So I mean, there's so many ways in which we could get at that, but yes, absolutely.
This is super interesting.
Thank you.
I'm going to try and formulate like one into a question, one thought. So I think a lot about common property in rangeland systems.
Yeah.
And you're really kind of making me realize how much I take for granted how I think about this issue because of the systems that I work in. But I'm curious about one thing. So one of the things that I think about a lot is how the actual privatization and centralization of people in the systems that I study has had a lot of negative consequences, both ecologically and socially, primarily because these are formerly sort of pastoral and nomadic systems. But
yeah.
I am curious if you can talk a little bit or speculate a little bit about how moving from, say, your upper right photo here in a sort of what you're calling a sort of common property neighborhood in a city to something that's much more what we are used to seeing today in terms of a blocks of homes and structured plots of land.
Yeah.
How going through that process and the sort of privatization or lack thereof has influenced the potentially influenced social dynamics and social access to power, I guess, and sort of the negotiation of that might go along with the actual property piece itself. Is that clear?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in there somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean,
like a social piece in there that
yeah.
has to be negotiated along with within the community.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is I think the beauty of thinking about socio-ecological or socio-natural relations. I mean, for me, who comes out of much of this from Marx, and thinking about the way in which kind of dialectics and philosophy of internal relations, right, which is very similar to an ecosystems approach, where everything is connected and we just have to figure it out. I mean, I think that what we see over the 19th and 20th century are these kind of growing processes of enclosure, of property, of marketization, of commodification of all things ecological or natural, water, air, you name it. And what it does is it creates these wedges that allow for greater uneven development, right? So you see folks being displaced, being dispossessed of their resources because they can't afford the commodity after it's been enclosed and marketized and privatized. So, when we look at like income inequality, it just says like a measure of social access, right? Like we know this, right? We see this, and it's madness. It's becoming out of control in lots of ways. So we then dial that back to some of the various sorts of ecological systems. I think about second home ownership in Western North Carolina, right? And the Coweta LTER project, and we have more impervious surface now on lands that are being kind of brought into property markets and increased runoff and hurting particular species of fish, in trout especially, that are kind of very important for this region. I can work through in my mind through a philosophy of internal relations and get from privatization, enclosure, commodification to those very clear ecological harms. At the same time, recognizing the social harms are just as ever present when many of the folks who used to live in the Macon County, our taxes are going up because of these rich second homeowners coming in, right? So they're being further pushed because of tax rates and less access to education. You know, we can go through the social metrics also, and it, you know, becomes very chaotic, but it all becomes necessary to try and bring it into focus and put it into tension and recognize how it unfolds, and then try and think about how to like engage it, I think. Margaret?
So I focused a lot on history of the Appalachian region, and maybe the timing is off, but I'm thinking about a lot of the dispossessed and the property-less people were moving into the high elevation areas that didn't have roads, deep into the Appalachian Mountains. And I've always been struck about how few African Americans are there. I grew up in parts of those regions, and yet, despite the timber companies and later the coal companies really sort of owning the land either directly or indirectly by mineral resources and so forth, the people there treated it as common land, and they moved freely. And so, was slavery so well established they could not escape and make similar migrations, or why didn't you see that movement into the...
Why did we see African American freed slaves moving into Appalachia?
Yeah.
Thinking about the access to some of these common, yeah.
I mean, the only reason it was populated the way it was and it was then exploited was because it was, you know, a lot of dispossessed people that didn't have access to education and property. Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I don't have a solid answer to. I would just speculate that I think that when we look at some of the migration patterns, like there were local kind of patterns of folks coming from the country into core cities. So we see the development of Atlanta and Birmingham and, you know, a host of other. And then later, way later, of course, we see the Great Northern Migration for economic purposes. You know, the time that I spent in the Southern Apps would say that I bet a lot of the knowledge of the common use issues were not known. I mean, you know, I mean, I think that, you know, a lot of folks are quite standoffish and private, maybe is a better way of thinking about it, and keeping to themselves, and had their own processes of kind of violent interactions in you know, by industrial barons and other kinds of extractive industries. So I think that would probably be the first thing that I would think, is just it didn't seem like a great opportunity given other options. And they didn't want to work the land.
And they didn't want, yeah, at that point they were looking for other ways of kind of thinking through how to reorganize their lives. And there weren't a lot of opportunities in terms of employment. So, I mean, I think that would probably, in my mind, be the main reason. But I'm just totally speculating. Morgan?
So I'm trying to figure out whether the phrase abolition ecology is trying to be ironic. Because, you know, I think the point is that, or at least as I was hearing you, is that Du Bois made the claim for abolition democracy.
Yeah.
But yet he was greatly pessimistic that it could be achieved. Yeah. But he didn't necessarily say, well, what happens if it isn't going to be achieved? Yeah. And so, are you saying, what would abolition ecology have been, and what are the consequences because it's not been achieved?
Sure.
I mean, that could be one
way
to frame it. So I'm just trying to understand the connection between abolition democracy and what was Du Bois, you know, what was going on in his head and all those things, and, you know, versus abolition ecology. Like, where are you going with that? And it's a historical narrative, or are you saying, well, or is it a positivist saying, well, we now need to have an abolition ecology, and what would we achieve with? I mean, there are two different ways that you could, and they're not mutually exclusive. So. No.
I mean, I think I'm using it in the kind of aspirational utopian sense, right? Which is what I think he was doing also, in lots of ways. I think that there are lots of problems with that also, though, and that, like, for instance, he talks a great deal, I think in chapter 8-ish, around private property relations as being so necessary for abolition democracy to succeed, right? Because he felt like, again, black folks needed to have private property in order to generate wealth. So it goes back to this point, which is not the point that I'm necessarily making when I'm talking about the commons. I think if we work this through like an EJ, you know, like, or some of those different sorts of contexts, we can start to see like the harms, the environmental harms that are done through these processes of enclosure, privatization, industrial placement, etc. I think that there's a lot of room to renegotiate and reimagine property relations that don't do that.
And I'm not quite sure where you get with the argument for commons. I mean, there have been two massive property rights takings in this country, which is ironic given how much there's a rhetoric about the importance of property rights. One of which was the massive dispossession of the native population, losing their property rights. The second was the Civil War, and African Americans no longer being property, and being now human beings. Right. That was a major property taking. Right, and then, but then what happened afterwards was this long, corrosive dispossession of their property rights to land. Right. But in that discussion, I'm not sure where commons fits in, but maybe that's part of the abolition ecology. So that was, I was struggling to
So the notion of commons for me is a direct response, I guess, in many ways to the unfettered privatization of resources that we see. So it's an alternative imaginary that if we think about the way in which the commodification of all things natural tends to proliferate, and so this is the whole neoliberal natures literature. There's not a whole lot of creative, I mean, we can talk about anti-capitalism, which is where most people go, and I'm happy to, like talking about that. But I think that how do we tie that into property and ecological resources in a slightly broader, maybe more creative way? So that's, I mean, it's yeah.
That makes sense. But then, do you need abolition? Okay.
Oh, you're cut off, dude.
I'm gonna free everyone else from this conversation. We're going to lunch together so they can continue this. We're gonna have happy hour at today at around 5 if any of you are interested in joining, and then probably go for dinner after that. Those of us going to lunch with us, if you'd like to meet over here in about 10 minutes, we'll make our way to Lemongrass, and let's give Nick another round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Sorry, I didn't mean to dominate.
Oh, you're good. You're good.